Welcome to the deep dive. Look, we know you're busy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Time is short.
Exactly. And you want to get what's going on, but without drowning in, endless news feeds.
Yeah, that's the idea.
So that's what we do here. We unpack the big stuff from the week, pull out the really insightful bits for you, fast.
And this time, we've got some really interesting topics lined up, things you might have seen flicker past.
Yeah, we dug into a YouTube discussion that covered three pretty big things.
Right. First up, that massive power outage in Europe. Spain and Portugal were hit hard.
Then there's the upcoming NATO summit here in the Netherlands, and, well, how people are feeling about that.
And finally, this campaign called My Social Free, kind of a social media detox challenge.
So the mission today is to get past those headlines, really understand the underlying issues, maybe some connections you didn't expect.
Exactly. And the source material had a lot of different voices, energy experts, concerned citizens, psychologists. Quite a mix.
Okay, let's jump right in. That European power outage, that sounded pretty serious.
Oh, it absolutely was. We're talking millions, literally millions of people in Portugal and Spain without power for hours.
Wow.
And tragically, it wasn't just inconvenient. There were reports of deaths, carbon monoxide poisoning, fires, people whose medical gear stopped working.
God, that really brings it home, doesn't it? How much we just rely on the power always being there.
Totally. And the first explanation that came out from the Dutch broadcaster NOS, it was, well, a bit unusual.
Yeah, I saw that. It's something about temperature swings messing with air particles around power lines, causing vibrations.
Exactly. That was the initial theory floated, but it seems like that explanation started getting questioned pretty quickly.
Okay, so not the full story, perhaps.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
We heard from Dennis Wandemai. He's an energy expert, and he was actually in Fuerteventura, part of Spain, obviously, when this all went down.
Oh, wow. Did he lose power?
Interestingly, no. He said their grid there is separate, runs on oil, so he wasn't directly impacted. But he's got this background, electrician originally, now works in sustainable energy. Very practical perspective.
Right. So what was his take?
Well, his first reaction was just the scale of it, how big it was, and how it immediately shows our total dependence on energy for our welfare, for everything.
Yeah, no kidding.
And he noted how some news outlets like the NS seemed quite quick to sort of blame climate-related stuff.
Oh, okay.
But his point was, hey, let's wait. Let's see what the actual grid operator's investigation says. Don't jump to conclusions.
That sounds sensible. Did he have other examples?
Yeah, he mentioned a similar big outage in the Balkans not too long ago. Initially, everyone blamed the heat, high demand, to sound familiar. But the real cause, found later, trees. Just trees that hadn't been pruned properly under the high voltage lines.
Huh. Sometimes it's simpler, isn't it?
Exactly. And then the Spanish grid operator, Red Electrica, they came out suggesting it was maybe a problem between grids, like a decoupling, they called it, between Spain and France.
Decoupling. So, like, the connection broke.
Sort of. Think of the whole European grid as this massive interconnected machine. If one big part suddenly disconnects from another, it can cause instability, like ripples in a pond.
Okay, so that interconnectedness is usually good, but can also cause problems.
Precisely. And this links into the whole stability question. You mentioned something earlier, rotating mass.
Yeah, I read that. Sounds technical. What is it?
It's basically inertia. Think of the big, heavy spinning generators in traditional power plants, coal, gas, nuclear. They have this physical momentum.
Okay.
That momentum helps keep the grid's frequency stable, smooths out little fluctuations. It's like a heavy flywheel keeping things steady.
Right. And solar and wind don't have that.
Not in the same way. They're dependent on, the sun shining or the wind blowing. They don't have that inherent physical inertia, so they're less stable, you could say, from a grid perspective.
Which means weather forecasts become super important then, yeah, for managing supply and demand.
They're absolutely critical. You need to know what renewables are likely to produce minute by minute, hour by hour to balance the grid.
Okay. And there was something else in that discussion about solar specifically, how it reacted.
Yes, this was interesting. Apparently, many solar power plants are designed to automatically disconnect if the grid frequency wobbles too much.
Like a safety switch?
Kind of, to protect themselves and maybe prevent a wider problem. But if a lot of solar disconnects at once, well, you suddenly lose a huge chunk of your power generation.
And was that relevant here?
It potentially explains that reported 60% drop in generation they saw, which happened when solar was producing a lot of the power.
Wow, okay. And it's not just Spain, is it? I heard the Netherlands relies heavily on solar, too, sometimes.
Hugely. At the time of that recording, they mentioned a figure, I think it was 73% of Dutch electricity was coming from solar at that moment.
73%, that's a lot.
Uh,
Managing that must be incredibly tricky.
it highlights the balancing act, definitely. Ondamage used an analogy, comparing a small gas leak in your house to a massive grid failure.
Right. One's contained, the other affects everyone.
Because it's all connected. And it's not just theory. They mentioned a local outage in Enschede in the Netherlands that same week.
Though that sounds like maybe a different cause. Digging damage, maybe?
Yeah, he said most unplanned local outages are actually caused by things like excavation work hitting cables, not necessarily these big climate or grid stability issues.
There was that slightly alarming anecdote, wasn't there, about a retired grid operator employee?
Yeah. The story was that this retired tenant guy said a complete grid failure in the Netherlands isn't if, but when.
Oof, that's unsettling.
Though, to be fair, the point was also made that the Dutch grid is better interconnected, has more diverse sources than maybe Spain does, so perhaps more resilient.
Okay, so let's try and wrap up Van de Mee's view on this energy transition overall.
Okay, so fundamentally, we need energy, that's clear. We're shifting from gas to electricity. Solar and wind are booming.
Yep.
But his question is, are we fully considering the stability side? Are we building the grid infrastructure and the backup systems needed to handle this massive shift to less predictable sources?
It's a big question. And did the discussion touch on why we're doing it so fast? Is it just CO2?
Well, that's where it got interesting. The CO2 reduction goal is obviously central, but Marc Leacqui, another voice in the discussion, he questioned if that's the only driver.
What did he mean?
He seemed to suggest maybe vested interests are also pushing the transition in certain directions. He even said he wouldn't rule out gas, even from Russia, and questioned the narrative around CO2 being the sole climate driver.
Oh, okay. Bringing in geology and plants needing CO2.
Right. And another panelist, Keys Over, added that climate change itself isn't new, historically speaking, and warned against making decisions driven by fear panic.
So a lot of different angles there. Did they talk about energy use itself? Like, are we just consuming too much?
Yeah. That definitely came up. The idea of energy addiction. Is the problem just how we generate it, or also how much we demand in the first place? A more fundamental question.
Right. One last thing on the outage cyber attack. Was that mentioned?
Briefly, Van de Mee thought large power plants are probably pretty secure, but a localized shutdown via cyber means possible, and that could then cause knock-on supply and demand issues.
Okay. So for people listening, maybe feeling a bit worried, what's the takeaway message?
Van de Mee's main point seemed to be, look, in highly interconnected grids like the Netherlands, these huge widespread blackouts are still pretty rare.
Okay. That's somewhat reassuring.
And if we did have a really long one, like days, the problems would be way bigger than just no lights. Think water, communication, everything. So it's serious, but maybe not panic stations time just yet.
Okay. Let's switch gears completely. NATO summit happening here June 24th and 25th.
Yep. And it's already stirring things up. We heard from Marc Leacqui again, the citizen from Woudenberg. He's strongly opposed.
That's his view.
He basically sees NATO as a warmongering organization, says it should be abolished. He's planning to protest with a group called Volkeren voor Vrije Peoples for Peace.
Right. And the preparations sound intense. Cameras everywhere, road closures.
Oh, yeah, 166 cameras just for traffic monitoring. They've apparently worked out 1,600 traffic scenarios for normal work and even more for NATO. Wow. Huge roads like June de Witlaan getting shut down. It's a massive operation.
So why does Leacqui oppose NATO so strongly? What's his reasoning?
He argues its original purpose, countering a Hitler-like threat, is long gone. Now he thinks it actually creates enemies by seeing any country or voice that doesn't agree as automatically hostile.
Okay. Did he give examples?
He pointed to Putin's speech back in 2007 in Munich, where Putin questioned NATO's expansion eastward. Leacqui connects that and what he calls the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014 to Russia's actions in 2022.
So he sees NATO expansion as a key provocation.
That's his view, yes. He believes NATO countries share responsibility for the current war, and that dismantling NATO is necessary for building real peace that takes Russia's security concerns seriously.
Of course, the other side of that coin, which came up in the discussion, is, well, Russia is bombing Ukrainian cities right now. It's hard to pinpoint where the aggression started, isn't it?
It is. It gets into that action is reaction cycle, the endless blame game. Liakowi's point is, instead of military buildup, maybe we should try extending a hand, try dialogue.
He also mentioned broken promises from the West.
Yeah, he argued that past agreements weren't kept, leading to deep mistrust from Russia. So any new peace structure needs to be built on equality and reliability. He even mentioned that Trump-Ukraine mineral deal is potentially shaky.
But the counter is always going to be that Russia needs to stop its actions too, right?
Absolutely, that was acknowledged. The discussion also highlighted how difficult it is to have a nuanced conversation these days. Criticize NATO policy, and you risk being labeled pro-Putin.
Yeah, that shuts down debate. What about Liaquil's background? Party for the Animals.
Right. He used to be a member, but left over their stance on Ukraine. He felt the party prioritized supporting Ukraine, framing it as a fellow democracy, over pushing for diplomacy to prevent a wider, maybe even nuclear conflict.
He tried to push for diplomacy within the party.
Yeah, he put forward a motion, but it got a negative voting advice and didn't get much support.
Interesting. Did he connect that to anything broader?
He sort of reflected on whether there's been a shift, particularly on the left, maybe away from embracing dissent towards more of a unified front where questioning the main narrative isn't as welcome.
So the protest message is anti-NATO, pro-negotiation.
Pretty much. Anti-NATO, negotiate now, and build global support for peace. They've got a website, volkerinvorvredi.nl, for info, signing up, donating for speakers. They're planning marches in The Hague, aiming to be visible near the summit.
Although the summit might move to Brussels.
There's talk of it, yeah. Police capacity issues in The Hague, union complaints. Liaqui said he wouldn't mind if it moved.
And the cost.
Yeah.
It's gone up a lot, hasn't it?
Hugely. From an estimated 95 million euros to 183 million just for security. And that's alongside general increases in defense spending.
Which naturally makes people ask,
Yeah.
could that money be used differently? How real is the external threat compared to, say, domestic problems?
Liaqui felt there's a growing public sense that maybe the problems aren't just out there, but also in here.
And that point about Ukrainians looking like us.
Yeah, he questioned that reasoning from his former party, asked, well, don't Russians look like us too? Questioning the basis for making those distinctions.
Which ties into basic psychology, right? In groups and out groups.
Exactly. That came up in the black box discussion too, our tendency to favor our own group and view others with suspicion.
Okay, fascinating stuff. Let's move to the final topic. My Social Free.
Right, this campaign. 3 Dutch people challenging everyone to ditch Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook for a month.
Like dry January, but for scrolling.
That's the idea. A social media detox. Even a LinkedIn ambassador is joining, but focusing more on work distractions, email, calendars, chats. They've got tips and a survival guide.
And you mentioned a psychologist weighed in. Vibrecht Belicht.
Yes, he analyzed the campaign. Interestingly, he admitted he couldn't fully join himself because, well, he needs to stay plugged in for his work, understand societal trends.
Which is fair enough. These campaigns often start strong, don't they? New Year's resolutions, Stoptober.
Yeah, initial enthusiasm is common. The big question Belicht considered is, could this one, My Social Free, actually reach that kind of mass participation level?
And what did he think?
He was somewhat optimistic. He thinks a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed by social media, the pressure, the constant noise. They might genuinely want a break, more freedom.
But it's not quite like quitting booze or smoking, is it? Social media is, well, social. Quitting can feel isolating.
That's a key difference. You need alternatives, other ways to connect or spend your time. It taps into addiction psychology. That fear of missing out, FOMO, makes it really hard to step away.
Did he get into the brain science?
A little bit, yeah. Basic stuff. The impulsive reptilian brain, the emotional limbic system, how they drive that urge to constantly check our phones, that quick dopamine hit.
We all know that feeling. Did he offer any magic cures?
No. He admitted he wants to reduce his own use, but said there isn't one simple psychological trick. He suggested practical things, like deleting the apps you don't absolutely need for work. Just remove the temptation.
Makes sense. Understand your own habits, maybe.
Exactly. And understanding the negative consequences can be a powerful motivator, too. He talked about the impact on neurohormones, like dopamine regulation, neural pathways, brain development.
Serious stuff.
Potentially, yes. Links to things like Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, depression are being researched, plus the more obvious things, sleep problems, impact on real-world relationships, work productivity.
So unlike dry January, where the hangover's pretty obvious, the damage from social media might be slower, more insidious, but still significant.
That was kind of the implication. And it's especially crucial for kids and teenagers whose brains are still wiring themselves up. Parental guidance is key there.
So what's the upside? What happens if you actually do take a month off?
Elites suggested things like experiencing silence again, reconnecting with yourself, having better quality social interactions face to face,
Hmm.
building more reciprocal relationships, especially parent-child, where you're actually present with each other, and just, doing other stuff, real-world activities.
There was that anecdote about Dennis Fendemai's son again, right?
Yeah.
The 11-year-old without a phone.
Yeah, it illustrated both the social awkwardness it can sometimes cause, but also the benefits.
Mm.
And the need for parents to actively provide other engaging things for kids to do if they're limiting screens.
Does how we use social media change with age?
Seems so. Belit suggested younger people might be focused on identity, figuring out who they are, midlifers, maybe more on managing life, careers. Older adults, perhaps information gathering, staying connected, different needs, different uses.
What about that news from Australia? Banning social media for under 16s.
Yeah, the Senate approved a bill. It would be the first country to do that government-mandated age restriction, though Australian students were apparently worried about communication, getting news.
And Belight's take on that, isn't there a risk of rebellion?
His counter was interesting. He argued that maybe young people are already sort of rebelling through disengagement, lack of focus, concentration, genuine interest, independent thought, partly because of the constant digital distraction.
So the cure isn't worse than the disease, in his view.
Potentially, though the practicalities of age bans, identity verification, privacy are real concerns. But Blake kept coming back to parental responsibility as the core issue.
It feels like this ties back to the other topic somehow. Consumption, maybe. Energy consumption, information consumption.
Exactly. The underlying ethical questions about how much we consume and why often get pushed aside by the algorithms designed to just keep us consuming more.
Keyes Over had a point about parents using devices as babysitters too, didn't he?
Yeah, the convenience factor. And he shared a funny story about his own daughters finding ways around internet time limits when they were teens. Kids are smart.
So maybe not bans, but advisories, like for alcohol or tobacco.
That was discussed. Treating it like other potential addictions that exist within a social context, it's not just an individual failing.
So realistically, does My Social Free have a shot at becoming the next Dry January?
Boyuchet seemed hopeful. He thinks awareness of the downsides is growing, even among kids themselves. And unlike, say, alcohol, maybe it's less about all or nothing and more about finding moderation.
Setting boundaries, which maybe we've forgotten how to do.
Could be. Teaching kids and ourselves moderation is key. Someone shared that feeling of emptiness after hours of scrolling, that brain fog.
We've all been there.
And you have to remember the vested interests, right? Big tech, advertisers, they want us hooked.
So any final quick tips for people listening who are tempted to cut back?
The main ones mentioned were delete the apps, schedule specific times for checking, or maybe try using social media mainly on a laptop, not your phone. Make it less accessible.
Okay, so quite a journey today. From a massive power grid failure showing our energy vulnerability.
To the deep divisions and questions around NATO's role and the path to peace.
And ending with this very personal, potentially societal challenge of managing our relationship with social media.
Yeah, 3 really different topics, but maybe with some common threads about consumption, stability, and conscious choices.
And that was the goal of this deep dive, right? To give you that shortcut, sip through the noise, offer different perspectives so you can form your own view.
Hopefully we've pulled out some useful nuggets for you.
So here's something to maybe chew on after listening.
Yeah.
With technology woven so deeply into, well, everything now, how is it actually changing us? Our societies, our connections, our own minds?
And maybe more importantly, what choices can we actively make to navigate all that? It's a lot to think about.
Definitely. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.